There is a piece of paper in the world worth $100. Next to it, there is another piece of paper, nearly identical in size, texture, and weight, worth nothing at all. Same material, same hands that could hold either one. But one of them can feed a family. The other is just paper. Nothing on the surface explains the difference. No gold is hidden inside. No power is stored within the ink. The only thing that separates them is an idea, one that millions of people across the world silently agreed to believe. And here's what makes that strange. Nobody voted on it. Nobody signed a personal contract. It simply became real because enough people decided it was. So why do human beings believe in something they cannot see and build entire lives around it? For most of human history, value was something you could hold in your hand. A farmer in ancient Mesopotamia didn't carry coins. He carried grain. If he needed sandals, he brought wheat to the cobbler. If he needed medicine, he offered oil or wool or dried fish. The exchange was simple, direct, and completely visible. What you gave was real. What you received was real. Value lived inside the object itself. You could smell it, weigh it, consume it. This system, which we now call barter, worked well enough in small communities where everyone knew each other. But it carried a quiet problem that grew larger as societies grew larger. What if the cobbler didn't need wheat that day? What if your grain was rotting, but you still needed those sandals? What if two people wanted completely different things, and neither one had exactly what the other needed? Economists call this the double coincidence of wants, the surprisingly difficult condition where two people must want precisely what the other is offering at exactly the same moment. In a small village, this could be managed. In a growing city, it became a serious obstacle. And so, slowly, people began searching for something better, not a specific object with direct use, but something that could act as a bridge, an agreed-upon middle step between what you had and what you wanted. Some cultures chose shells. The cowrie shell, small and smooth and consistent in shape, was used as currency across parts of Africa, South Asia, and China for thousands of years. At its peak, cowrie shells were one of the most widely accepted forms of money in the ancient world. But notice what happened in that choice. The shell had no nutritional value. You couldn't build a house from it. You couldn't wear it through a cold winter. Its power came entirely from the fact that others accepted it. The belief was already beginning. Metals followed. Copper, silver, gold. These had some real qualities. They were durable, scarce, and consistent. But even here, something interesting was happening beneath the surface. A piece of silver didn't nourish you. It couldn't shelter you. What gave it power was the collective understanding that it could be exchanged for things that could. The metal was real. The value was agreed upon. And then came the first coins, stamped with the faces of rulers and the symbols of states. This was a turning point that is easy to overlook. A coin didn't just represent a weight of metal anymore. It represented authority. The image pressed into it said, "This is guaranteed." Trust was no longer just between two people in a marketplace. It was being transferred upward, toward an institution, toward a power that most ordinary people would never meet in person. This was the moment the invisible entered the story. Value was still wrapped in something physical, but for the first time what truly mattered was not the object itself. It was what the object promised. And a promise, by its very nature, lives in the mind, not in the hand. For centuries, the coin held everything together. It was small enough to carry, durable enough to last, and real enough to silence doubt. If you questioned the value of what you held, you could bite it, weigh it, or melt it down. The metal was always there, waiting beneath the symbol. That physical reassurance, that final layer of the real, kept the system stable and kept human anxiety quiet. But coins had their own limitations. They were heavy. They were dangerous to carry across long distances. A merchant traveling from Venice to Constantinople with enough silver to fund a trading voyage was also carrying a very good reason for someone to kill him along the road. And so, out of practical necessity, something new emerged. In medieval Europe, wealthy merchants began depositing their gold and silver with goldsmiths, craftsmen who already had strong vaults and the tools to protect valuable metal. In return, the goldsmith would issue a written receipt, a piece of paper that said, in effect, "This person has real metal stored here and may claim it at any time." These receipts began to circulate. Instead of retrieving their gold and physically handing it to someone else, merchants discovered they could simply transfer the receipt. The paper traveled instead of the metal. And because the goldsmiths were trusted, the paper was trusted too. This was the quiet birth of the banknote, and it changed everything. By the 17th century, institutions began formalizing this process. The Bank of Sweden issued what are considered the first true European banknotes in 1661. The idea spread. Banks would hold reserves of gold and issue paper notes that represented those reserves. In theory, anyone holding a note could walk into the bank and exchange it for the real metal behind it. But here's where the story deepens. Bankers noticed something. Most people, most of the time, never came to reclaim their gold. The paper circulated, changed hands, bought goods, and settled debts, while the metal sat untouched in the vault. And so banks began doing something that would define modern finance forever. They issued more notes than they had gold to back them. Not recklessly, at first. Carefully, cautiously, with calculated risk. But the act itself was profound. It meant that a portion of the money in circulation was no longer representing anything physical at all. It was representing faith that the bank was solvent, faith that others would continue accepting the paper, faith that the system would hold. A simple human example makes this vivid. Imagine a man in 18th century London receiving a banknote as payment for a year of hard labor. He has never visited the bank that issued it. He has never seen the gold it supposedly represents. He accepts it without hesitation and uses it the next morning to buy bread. The baker accepts it too. Neither man questions it. Neither man needs to. The belief is already so embedded in daily life that it has become invisible, that invisibility is not weakness. It is, in fact, the system working exactly as intended. When trust becomes unconscious, it becomes powerful. And power, once established, builds structures around itself. Structures that begin to feel permanent, natural, and inevitable. The invisible was no longer an experiment. It was becoming the foundation. Every system built on belief carries a hidden question inside it. Not a question anyone asks out loud. Not one that appears in contracts or textbooks or the careful language of financial institutions. But it lives there quietly, underneath every transaction, every paycheck, every number on a screen. What happens if people stop believing? For most of history, that question stayed buried. The system functioned, the paper circulated, the faith held. But there were moments, sharp, brutal, unforgettable moments when the question forced its way to the surface. And what those moments revealed was something deeply uncomfortable about the nature of invisible value. In 1720, France was riding a wave of extraordinary economic excitement. A Scottish financier named John Law had convinced the French government to issue paper money on a massive scale, backed not by gold but by the projected future profits of a trading company operating in the Mississippi Valley. Shares in the company soared. Paper wealth multiplied at a speed that felt miraculous. Ordinary people who had never owned anything of significance suddenly held certificates that seemed to make them rich. And then the projections failed. The profits never arrived. Confidence cracked. Slowly at first, then all at once. People rushed to convert their paper back into something real, but there was not enough real to go around. The wealth that had felt so solid, so earned, so present, simply ceased to exist. Not because anything physical had been destroyed, but because the belief had died. This is what makes financial collapse so uniquely devastating and so uniquely strange. A flood destroys crops that were genuinely there. A fire burns buildings that genuinely stood, but a collapse of monetary faith destroys things that were, in a very real sense, never entirely there to begin with. The loss is real. The suffering is real. But what was lost was largely a shared agreement. And agreements can evaporate far faster than stone or grain. Consider what this means for ordinary people caught inside that moment. A widow in Weimar, Germany in the early 1920s had carefully saved her husband's life insurance payment, a sum that had once been enough to live on for years. Within months of hyperinflation taking hold, that same sum could not buy a loaf of bread. She had to do everything right. She had trusted the system completely, and the system had not failed to any fault she could point to, or fight against, or understand. It had failed because enough people, somewhere, had stopped believing, and that loss of belief moved through the economy like a fire through dry grass. This is the hidden cost that never appears in the original promise. When we accept invisible value, we accept invisible risk, not risk from thieves or weather or bad harvests, but risk from something far harder to defend against. The risk that the collective agreement that holds everything together might, one day, simply unravel. And the most unsettling part is this. Even knowing that risk exists, we continue. We have always continued, which raises a question we're sitting with, not with fear, but with honest curiosity. Why? The system broke, and then it was rebuilt, and then it broke again, and then it was rebuilt again. each time a little more abstract than before. This is the pattern that defines the entire modern history of money. Not a straight line of progress, but a repeated cycle: crisis, collapse, reconstruction. And with each reconstruction, the distance between currency and anything physical grew a little wider, a little harder to see. The most significant break came in the 20th century. For generations, the major currencies of the world had operated under what was known as the gold standard, a formal promise that paper money could be exchanged for a fixed quantity of gold held in government reserves. It was an imperfect system, rigid and limiting in ways that economists still debate. But it offered something psychologically powerful: a floor, a final physical answer to the question of what money was actually worth. In 1971, that floor was removed. U.S. President Richard Nixon announced that the American dollar would no longer be convertible to gold. One by one, other nations followed. The currencies of the world became what economists call fiat money, value declared by government authority, backed not by any physical reserve but by institutional trust alone. This was, in the clearest possible terms, a global decision to make the invisible permanent. And yet, almost nothing changed in daily life. People went to work the next morning. Shops opened. Wages were paid. The bread was still purchased. The rent was still collected. The world continued turning with barely a pause, because by 1971, the psychological work had already been done. Decades of living inside the system had made the abstraction feel completely natural. The gold had not been in most people's thoughts for a long time anyway. What followed was an acceleration. Credit cards removed the last physical gesture from most transactions, the act of handing something over. Electronic transfers made money move at the speed of a keystroke. And today, entire financial lives exist as numbers shifting between databases, in forms that have no physical expression whatsoever. A young professional in any major city today might go weeks without touching a banknote. Her salary arrives as data, her rent leaves as data. Her savings exist as a number she checks on a small screen each morning. If you asked her to point to her money, to show you where it actually is, she could not do it, not because she is careless, but because there is genuinely nowhere to point. And she does not find this troubling. Neither do most of us. That comfort, that complete, unexamined ease with the invisible, is perhaps the most remarkable achievement in the entire history of human economic life. Not the technology that enabled it, not the institutions that formalized it, but the quiet, profound normalization of belief itself. We were once people who needed to hold value in our hands. We became people who needed only to trust a piece of paper. And now we have become something further still. People who need only a number and a faith so deep it no longer feels like faith at all. It simply feels like reality. So let us return to the question we began with, not as an economic puzzle, not as a problem requiring a technical answer, but as a human question, one that reaches deeper than finance, deeper than history, deeper even than money itself. Why do we believe in something we cannot see? The easy answer is convenience. The invisible is practical. It is lighter than gold, faster than barter, more flexible than any physical object could ever be. And that is true. But convenience alone does not explain the depth of the commitment. Convenience does not explain why, across thousands of years and dozens of collapsed systems and countless moments of painful, personal loss, human beings have always rebuilt the invisible rather than abandoned it. There is something else at work. Philosophers and anthropologists have long observed that human beings are, at their core, creatures of shared meaning. We do not simply live in the physical world. We live inside stories we tell together. The value of a currency, the authority of a law, the significance of a flag, the meaning of a name. None of these exist in nature. You will not find them in a forest or at the bottom of the sea. They exist because groups of people agreed to treat them as real, and, in agreeing, made them real. Money in this light is not primarily an economic tool. It is a social one. It is proof that human beings can coordinate belief at an extraordinary scale, across languages, borders, generations, and centuries. That a farmer in ancient China and a trader in medieval Venice and a student checking her phone balance this morning are all participating in the same fundamental act, the act of trusting something that cannot be fully verified, because enough other people are trusting it too. This capacity is genuinely remarkable. It is, in many ways, what separates human civilization from everything else on Earth. Our ability to build invisible structures, currencies, laws, institutions, nations, and then inhabit them as though they were made of stone. But that same capacity carries its quiet shadow. Because the structures are invisible, they're also fragile in ways that stone is not. They depend, always, on continued belief. And belief is a human thing, which means it is also a fearful thing, a doubtful thing, a thing that can be shaken by crisis or manipulation, or simply by enough people quietly deciding to look too closely. The history of hidden currencies is, in the end, a story about us, about our hunger for stability in a world that offers none, about our willingness to build systems of trust so elaborate, so deeply embedded, that they eventually become invisible even to ourselves, about the strange and profound fact that the most powerful things in human life, the things that shape how we eat, sleep, work, and worry, are things we invented, together, out of nothing more than shared belief. And perhaps that is not frightening. Perhaps that is extraordinary. Perhaps the ability to believe in the invisible, to build something real from nothing but agreement, is not a weakness in human nature. Perhaps it is the most human thing about us. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.